Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. So thank you all for joining us here tonight. Thank you for listening after the fact. It is my pleasure to welcome on to the podcast Brian Wilkins, who is actually a return guest and friend of the show. And I am very happy to have Brian on tonight to discuss the new work that is very soon to be out in the world, which I've been looking forward to for a while. That is an Oracle deck, which is the Oracle of Decans, and the book companion to that, which is The Wheel of Small Gods. And this is released by Revelor Press. These two works are a reintroduction of ritual healing practices and engagement with the 36 Decan spirits from the Egyptian zodiac. It is a phenomenal work of poetry, of divination, and an exploration of work with these very powerful and very, very ancient spirits, which I have been privileged to get to see in pre-release, and I'm sure you will all be very fascinated to hear him speak about, and then to hopefully be able to dive in and engage with these spirits yourself after the fact. Brian is a poet, a magician, a diviner. He is quite well known as a geomancer. That is why he was on the podcast originally. He received an MFA in poetry from the University of New Hampshire, and he is also a Northern Wu style Tai Chi teacher and an overall wonderful human being and author. And I am so happy to have you on the show tonight, Brian.
Thank you, Joanna. That's super nice. I'm excited to be back. When I realized I was going to get a chance to come back on again, I was like, oh, this is the best. I love having chats with you about divination and magic and, any other weirdness we come across.
There is certainly a lot of that to discuss. So we'll do what we can to cover as much as we can in this interview. So for those who are listening, who are less familiar with why you were on the show, can you tell us a little bit about A Wheel of Small Gods and the Oracle of Decans and this project? How did this come to be? What is this, and how did you come to it?
So as you said in the introduction, the A Wheel of Small Gods is an introduction to the 36 Decan spirits and a practical method of healing magic. This got started because Gordon White, 4 years ago, on his Rune Soup members forum, started a ritual for getting into contact with the 36 Decans of the Egyptian zodiac. For people who don't know, those spirits are sort of time spirits, the spirits of a place in the zodiac. That were originally connected with stars, but then sort of as procession happened, they ended up being attached to the zodiac itself as they went forward. They were traditionally known for healing, both taking away and giving disease, actually, and also for regulating the spirits of that time as well, so the seasonal elements that were present there. In the process of going through that year-long ritual, it became clear to me that the spirits would like it if I wrote some poems, and then through a process of beginning to pay tribute to them in the timing, it became clear to me that these were meant to be active poems. These were operant works of magic rather than simply just paying tribute. And the book started there. So I wrote it over 3 years. I did, the first year was the ritual, second year was the actual writing of the poems, and the third year was editing. In the same time frame, it became the spirits basically made clear to me that illustrations were necessary for the method to work. So we reached out to my collaborator Brennan Reese, who also made a sort of sketches in the talismanic timing. So the book itself was all done inside the Decan timing, and then he transformed those into sort of digital woodcuts. So the book is a digital woodcut and a poem facing the image of the spirit. And so you mentioned that this sort of unfolded over the course of 3 years of working with this, and these spirits, as you mentioned, are associated with both the illness and the healing of
a particular area of the body or a particular area of the soul or the spirit. And they're also associated with time, correct? All of those things being sort of interwoven.
Yes,
So when you
one
were,
concept.
yes. So when you were first engaging with these spirits, was it during the first year that you conceived of like a beginning to write poetry, or did that come a little bit later in your sort of encounters with these spirits?
It was in the first year. I'm not going to go into too many details of the ritual process itself, because it's available on Rune Soup and it's Gordon's work, and I highly recommend people go and change their lives by dealing with it. It's really fantastic. But I am happy to talk a little bit about my own experience, what it means. I think sometimes we get very vague as magicians, and we say, oh, I contacted the spirit, and it's like, well, what does that actually look like? For me, it looked like largely doing this work outside, mostly at my home, although in some various places, and doing the rite and sitting and waiting for the spirit to present themselves and have a conversation. The way that presents for me is largely in my mind's eye. There were some visible effects that happened as well, but the actual presentation of the spirit is something where it becomes clear to me that the spirit is present in my imagination. And I don't mean that at all to say this is less real. I know some people are like, if it's not an optical appearance that shakes a tree, then it's not a real thing. But that's not my experience at all. And one of the things I think taught me the most on this was Ramsey Dukes' book, How to See Fairies, where he sort of introduces the idea of the imagination as the point of translation between spirit and matter. That's not a division I really buy into too much, but you know what I mean, the spirit folks. And so in that first year, as I began engaging with these spirits, some of them asked me to write them a poem, or some of them said, oh, poetry would be really great here. But it was also in that first year that I did the first healing work with it. And that really changed the scope of what I understood the project to be at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. In the book, you go into a beautiful amount of detail, which I think is a really lovely, and I think one of the best introductions I've seen to a very visceral explanation of what a healing ritual and a trip to a Asclepion in let's say 157 AD, I think is the year you used as an example, in Pergamum, to go to one of these ritual healing sites that was dedicated to the god Asclepius. And as you know, and as some of our listeners already know, Asclepius is a god whom I work with. Apollo is a god whom I work with closely. And this idea of the linkage between the god and the spirits of medicine and healing, and actual practicing, surgeons and physicians at a temple that is sacred to those deities, was something that was just, common practice in the ancient Greek and Hellenistic world at the time. And you really put very beautifully, I think, the connections between healing and the gods, both on the mundane and the spiritual level, those connections. And I was wondering if you could kind of just talk to us a little bit about those connections here for people who haven't read that.
Yeah. Every book of magic poetry should start with a 20-page essay about placebo effects and Greek history. That's how they should all start.
I agree with that.
Yeah. One of the things, as I was trying to, I wanted to explain a little bit about when you write a book of healing magic, I think it's sort of incumbent to talk a little bit about what that means and what it comes out of. And this all actually started with a realization, a sort of question. My son has asthma, and when he was younger, there was a lot of moments where we had to go to the hospital and he needed treatment. And you come across this thing where people will begin to say things to you like, well, glad it wasn't 100 years ago. What would have happened then? And that idea really bothered me for a while as a historian by background and just by interest. And 100 years ago, he actually would have been in a lot of trouble, because they, at that point, thought that asthma was better solved by the talking cure. So thanks, psychology. But in the classical world, in 157, he would have been actually treated very similarly to the way he is now. So that was the genesis for talking about how do we go to the temple? How do we think about this? So you would go, if you had an illness of any kind, you would go to the temple, the Asclepion. You would be greeted first. You would actually, interestingly enough, walk past as you go in all of these offerings and votives to the gods in thanks for their successful healing, which is important in terms of what we'll get to in a little bit. But so you walk in, you see these things, you are usually cleaned and given a ritual clothing to wear, often white robes. Then you are escorted into your first consultation with the priest, who is also a practicing physician, most commonly. But in this case, almost entirely, you'd be seeing the practicing physical physician. And they would give you an examination, and then they would send you to effectively a dietitian. And they would send you to someone to analyze your physical fitness, to look at whether or not you needed to do some kind of regime change there, which could involve things like travel or pilgrimage as well. And then you would be given a space to go and have a dream. And so you would dream, hopefully, of the god. If you didn't dream of Asclepius, you would hopefully dream of a dog or a snake. These were both incredibly favorable omens. Then you would be brought back to the priest once you'd had your dream. The priest would interpret the dream, and then would give you a series of prescriptions. And so the prescriptions would be usually some sort of what we would think of now as an herbal medicine, or like a physical medicine to deal with your condition, usually a dietary change of some kind. Then you would again be given a physical regime to change, and then you would be given magic to deal with. You would be given a sort of image or mantra or fragment of poetry, a talisman of some kind to take with you as to further your healing. The thing that I think people miss about this process is not just how amazing it would be if we got anywhere close to this level of healthcare now, but also that it is on a spectrum from there to now. There is no difference really, except we've cut out the magic. Galen and his contemporaries were doing brain surgery. They were identifying the different parts of the eye. They had a complicated discussion about vivisection, which is one of the reasons they stopped doing quite so much dissection. But there was a real attempt to understand the human body in a physical way. Galen himself got his job as chief surgeon for the gladiators of Pergamum by, this is a little intense, but taking a monkey with him to his job interview, opening up its bowels and asking the other surgeons to fix it. When they looked at him with horror, he said, no big deal, fixed it, and the monkey was fine. And that's how he got the job. So these are not people who aren't serious about physical science and medical treatment. One of the things that struck me was if I had approached Galen to heal my son with asthma, he would have advised me to make a compound from a plant that provides stramonium, which is still one of the main ingredients in inhalers today. And he would have provided it by having a clay pot built with a long tube with a tincture of the substance in there, heated under water to create steam for inhalation. What we have now is obviously a better shelf-stable, more portable model of the inhaler, but Galen was using effectively an inhaler. This is a change in, honestly, just delivery more than it is of idea. Pliny the Elder suggested ephedra for allergic reactions. I mean, these things are consistent. So I was left with the question of, well, if they had all this going on and they really thought, I mean, obviously I think the magic's important, but you start to realize that like, it's a real strange move in history to say, we're going to use everything except the magic.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is it's also a snippet out of time, which I think that when we look at these issues, it's very easy to be prejudiced by what we have grown up and been around, because we are products of our culture. We can't help it. And therefore, because we are such short-lived little creatures, we forget that in the scope of human history, the fact that we've cut out magic has been only a tiny blip in the history of how humans have dealt with illness and disease and all other, issues that come along with being human. This is actually only a tiny amount of time that has been cut out. But as you say, it is, and also only in one
yes.
arguably very localized segment of the population of the earth, which we
Right.
just happen to be in, which is why we're speaking English. But for those reasons, it is easy to feel like it's, well, I guess we moved beyond that, but it's actually clearly not the case. And as you say, it's something that is a strange thing that we've left out. You then go into a very interesting discussion. Again, when you said, every book of poetry should begin with a 20-page essay on history and magic, I'm like, well, yes, I think that they all need to, and I think all magic books should then have more poetry in them. So I
I
think
agree.
we need to have both. But you go into a very excellent discussion of the of the placebo effect and also the nocebo effect. And it was a complete fluke of how things worked out on my end from a tech perspective, that the last episode that was just released on my podcast was my interview with Peter Mark Adams on his
That's right.
the Healing Fields book that he just put out. So we just had this fantastic conversation about healing modalities and the impact of, the mind on healing, of different layers of being on what it means to be well or to be healthy. And then immediately after is your podcast. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about what because you found an interesting way of bringing up things with the placebo effect, which everyone at this point is familiar with, probably those words, placebo and nocebo, and what they mean. I think you should still kind of set out your definition.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
then there's more to looking at how that interacts with our healing process and how we think about prayer and the act of getting well or not getting well. And I think that the way you put that was very excellent and good food for thought.
Thank you. Again, I'm going to follow Ramsey Dukes a little bit on this. He actually said that there's no difference between placebo healing and magical healing. That's the same thing. It's just the words we use for scientific stuff. But placebo originally meant simply the inert substance that was given. It has since come to mean the entire process of psychological, social, and intellectual constructs that are applied in and around the giving of a medicine, or a treatment, I should say. So I got really obsessed with this idea of like, why aren't we doing this? And found out actually we are doing this. And in fact, there's lots of big arguments about it. And I would say at this point, there is an incredibly robust scientific literature from a scientific materialist point of view that says if you're not doing placebo healing, then you are not fully healing the patient. In particular, I came across this article by a professional medical organization in Germany, where they were actually concerned about the nocebo effect, so inducing negative side effects in your patients because of how a doctor presents material. And in fact, the reason they were bringing it up is our bad bedside manner actually malpractice? Are we suable for cursing our patients? And there's a plethora of studies that show that the introduction of talking about side effects can induce them in people. One of my favorites was giving lactose intolerance to people who were not previously lactose intolerant by including them in a study on lactose intolerance, where the group that was not previously lactose intolerant and was only given the sugar pill, not the actual lactose, became lactose intolerant through the purpose of the study, or at least demonstrated all the symptoms there, that was mentioned. So you start to realize that, well, actually, our presentation and our mindset about this matters quite a lot, to the extent that many drug trials now cannot beat placebo, leaving you the question of like, what is the actual effect that's being used here? One of the things that struck me in terms of magical practice, specifically when we deal with healing and when we deal with this, was the introduction of doubt as a method of cursing. So I come from a Protestant Christian background. My folks are very, devout and well-meaning Christians. And my father's a Baptist minister. And so that is the background of prayer with which I am most familiar. It was not uncommon to hear the phrasing, which I think will feel familiar to most people, of someone saying, oh, so-and-so is sick. We pray that God heals so-and-so if it be his will. Well, the moment you add if it be his will, you have introduced doubt into the effect. And that would actually fall into the category of nocebo effects that the German physicians organization was saying you should not do. That literally you have cursed the person instead of healing them in that exact moment. And I think so much of the time that we move forward into these spaces without surety, without the idea that we are doing something good, that we're bringing in the baggage of our own doubt on someone else. And frankly, I don't think that's our business. Our business is to do good and not worry about the rest of it. I understand, though, and I want people to understand too, that I think it is probably a rare occasion where you can just walk up to someone and say, be healed. And there you go, you're all settled. It's part of a larger context that involves plant spirits, rest, time, our own human interaction, the disease itself, the spirit of these events, all being brought together to create a favorable environment for this to occur. For my quick and dirty take on it, if you don't like long conversations on placebo, is if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons and you need to make a healing save, you want a +1, +2 on your healing save. Placebo healing is always that +1, +2, +3. Does that mean you're always going to get the effect you wanted? No, it does not. Does it mean you are going to help? Yes, you're going to help every single time. And so that is the movement in this sort of magical approach that I'm trying to bring to people. It's very much a yes and to Western medicine.
Absolutely. I think that the what it appears to me with some of this is that when we're having the conversation of not introducing doubt, shall we say, into the possibility of for example, using that prayer example of if it be God's will, that comes from the way that we look at being ill or being well also, I think.
True.
And the way that we think with what it means to be with the spirit of sickness. When you are in a culture that kind of takes the personhood of illness itself more seriously, then you might not fall into quite as many leg traps around the fact that you can be explicitly positive about, I am going to direct prayer at this, and I'm going to not speak about doubt. But still you are in a culture that might recognize that there's a multiplicity of forces at play, which doesn't mean that I am going to explicitly say to you, Brian, well, there's a multiplicity of forces and who knows, but because you and I come from a worldview where we already kind of like have that intrinsically there, we can still try to throw for our +1 or our +2 save, for the healing without needing to explicitly state that. But that's only if we are in a context where we kind of have that joint understanding as a culture of what that means. Does that make sense? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
It does. And I think, what we're talking about is our animist approach to these topics and attempting to provide the proper network of relationships that these spirits involve ourselves in. I draw on the work of Munya Andrews, who again, an Aboriginal teacher who I again found her book through Gordon White, and talking about sort of sickness dreaming and this concept. I think it is always a little bit hazardous to simply compare, but I'm going to steal again from Gordon and say something like that. It very much existed in the Greco-Egyptian tradition, that they understood that these spirits, these gods you're talking with, are providing this information of disease with you. This is a place in which communication is happening. I think there is let's take, for example, I had a really bad flu about 3 years ago. Just one of those, it was 10 days. I literally could not do anything but move from the bed to get water and then move back to the bed. That was all I could do. In the process, I had this really intense dream where all of my thoughts were bees and they were all buzzing, and I was trying to keep track of each of my thoughts individually. And in the fever dream, it became clear to me that I needed to stop doing this. Actually, I do mention this story in the book, but I don't mention this part. my magical partner, Jess Waters, did a working to help me while I was sick with that flu. And her intervention actually came into the dream and was what told me, hey, stop trying to keep track of all your thoughts, dummy. Like, that's not how this works. When I relaxed and did that, my fever broke and I immediately began my access to recovery. I also learned something intense from that flu. It taught me about how my mind was working. It taught me about my need to over control my own thoughts, leading to an imbalance in me that exposed me to these kind of illnesses. And it taught me to be healthier in the long run. So the thing I want to pause with that, though, is I understand there are a lot of people who have chronic conditions. And these can, you can hear someone talk about like, oh, the illness is teaching you something. And, it can feel like victim blaming and like, oh, your pain is just there to teach you. I actually don't think that's true either. Just in the same way that I don't accept every person coming and sitting in my house, I don't accept every spirit coming to sit in my house either. And I think that it can be very easy to say, all spirit, all illness is a lesson from the universe for me to understand. But from my animist point of view, like, no, sometimes these spirits are being jackasses and they've crossed the boundary lines and they need to be put back in their own place. And to me, that is to some extent what another place where healing magic is incredibly important, because, suffering is not, you can learn things while you suffer. This is 100% true. But there is a point past which is diminishing returns and it is just pain. I do not think as a magician and as someone who works with healing magic, I am meant to sit by the side while people suffer and say, please accept your pain. It's teaching. No, I think we're supposed to heal. I think that is a part of our function. It is as natural for me to heal as it is for someone to suffer. And so we should be doing that and working with that. So I think that's an important distinction, that just because a spirit shows up and wants to talk to you doesn't mean you have to or want to or need to. And just because a spirit is causing you illness doesn't mean it's necessarily for your benefit. You have to decide that and try to work with what you can.
Absolutely. I think that's a really, really important point, because sometimes when we are engrossed in this discussion of spirits, it can mean that people can start to want to make everything that has the word spirit around it into a good thing, which It is not necessarily so. Not everything has your best interest at heart. Not everything is appropriate to be in your house or in your body or in your mind or anything else of that nature. And that's very important to understand those boundaries. And as you said, to do the work of healing and not to sit idly by. I think, though, also that brings up the idea of, when we are talking about this from an animist perspective, which this came up in my interview with Peter as well, the idea being that when the moment we introduce multiplicity of forces and multiplicity of spirits and things of that nature, it kind of helps, I think, take away that tinge of victim blaming in sort of sometimes new thought ideas of healing magic, because it's not saying like, oh, if you're unwell, it's just that you didn't think good enough or you didn't try hard enough or something like that, because not everything is inside of you. There are forces at play that are much bigger than you, and therefore you are powerful in terms of your interactions with them, and you can have great effects, for your own benefit or the benefit of someone else, but it's not just solely on you. Well, I guess you're suffering because you wanted to suffer, or you didn't try not to suffer.
It's definitely not that. That's a very, I'm very allergic to that kind of attitude. And I saw that Jessica has a very clever question actually in the Q&A. I would come back to it in a second because I think it's fun to play with. But just as an example of what we're talking about, I just saw today, we were chatting right before we went on, that there's an article in Nature that is talking about how the serotonin model of depression doesn't really have a leg to stand on. Again, we're talking about Nature. This is a very huge scientific journal. every academic I know in the sciences would love to get published there. And it's also published in Molecular Psychiatry. It's Joanna Moncrief is the principal author. It's a rundown that says this entire model doesn't have the physical evidence it claims to have. In addition, the part that's most interesting for this conversation is that it puts forward the idea that by promoting this model of chemical imbalance, it actually made it harder for people to get better with other therapies, because they were then basically cursed with the idea that they have a dependency that must be corrected through intervention of a drug in order to get better, and that they'll probably have a lifetime dependency. So this actually impaired people's progress in getting better. But you were just talking about strength, and this is the thing I find really fascinating. I know people who have taken, SSRIs and things like that and seen improvement in their depression. So the question then is like, okay, well, the evidence says that physically this did not do much to help in those areas, and yet I took this and saw a response. That to me speaks to your own internal magical healing power, that you took the information from this idea and transformed your own life with it magically, because what was given to you was a curse and you turned it into a blessing that fed your own ability to flourish. That's the kind of thing we're talking about, and why it's so important to acknowledge people's own strength in these places. So I was struck, but I mean, I'm always struck by by science when it actually works, using its own method to examine things very well. I guarantee you this article will be buried as fast as humanly possible, and people will begin stressing on it. But it's not a case of I'm the hippie wandering through the woods, the witchy fellow and the poet who's telling you this. This is the serious scientists are telling you that this is how healing works as well.
Yeah. Yes. It's at this point, it's criminal only when it is ignored, because it is now so scientifically, materialistically present that it makes no logical sense to ignore, because even if you want to believe none of it, even just from a completely selfish perspective, doing it makes everything easier and better. So it really makes no logical sense to ignore anymore, although as there are unfortunately a lot of factors that may still lead to it being buried, as you mentioned. So we should see what happens.
I think too that it points to another thing, which is that, if you go to a healer like Peter Mark Adams, like you're talking about, you go to these other people, they have ways of dealing with this. There's a whole tradition of magical healers that have been doing this sort of thing for an incredibly long time. I actually think it's even more incumbent on us now to be doing this kind of healing, because it's going to take doctors and everyone else a very long time to catch up. In addition, I think we do need to be responsible and think seriously about how we approach this, so as to not be doing cursing while we're doing this kind of work. And to this, I saw that Jessica put in a very clever question here, which is, what if you ask someone to doubt their self-doubt? Right? So, are we cursing the demon of self-doubt in that case, right? Like, are we somehow damaging that? I personally wouldn't take that approach, because I think it's let me back up for a second. I don't think it's a mistake that Jesus is figured as an exorcist and a healer, right? I think that Jesus the magician, Jesus the figure, however you want to approach that, there's some real tech there. My basic take on the Gospels is that they're tech. They're not actually theology. Theology is kind of crap, but the tech is really good. And in this case, and as I've seen with like intention group work and everything else, the introduction of the positive is the stronger medicine than the introduction of the negative. I think this is also kind of true in dealing with other curse scenarios, right? I think if you can bless up and fix the problem that way, your effects are lower, things are easier to deal with. Does it mean there's never a time to curse? No. And I think also there might be a time to cause someone to doubt the self-doubt. It's just going to be a less generally effective method because you're cycling in on that doubt over and over again.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from a putting witch hat on as opposed to necessarily just podcaster host.
You guys can't really see this for a second, but Joanna just put on an amazing witch's hat.
It's an amazing, well, so Brian, you can see it. Okay, fantastic. I usually
can,
keep the glamour up for other people, but
thank you.
Sorry, if you're watching this on the webinar replay, you probably won't see it, but you know.
Yeah.
Yes. So from just from a magical perspective, in our tradition is we are almost always telling people to phrase in the positive. That also goes back to what we've been saying about the placebo and all these other effects, where scientifically it's also shown to have much stronger effects when things are phrased in the positive. It's easier for the universe, it seems, to interact with. It's easier for us to interact with. It seems like spirits like to interact with that, though that depends on the spirit and depends on the context, that's for sure. And that doesn't mean, as you said, that there's no place for cursing, no place for getting rid of or doubting the self-doubt. There are times and places for that, but it's generally, I think that's usually the easier.
Well, and also something
a lot of times.
And something to be handled by someone who understands this very well. To continue to allow Jessica's question to kind of manifest a little bit and let her voice come into the conversation. She raises the idea of in a session with a patient who may say, "I can't overcome my depression," allowing there to be let me say it exactly so I get you right, Jessica, to consider a moment they should doubt the concept of the impossibility, right? And I think that's actually probably the best case for what you're talking about that you could do, right? Because then you're also in a longer term engagement in which you're going to then supply the skill set for that person to provide their own positive help or offer them in that direction. So you sort of weaken the illness and then move around it. I'm doing lots of hand gestures that explain everything very deeply. So I think Jessica, that's actually probably the best example of how that works in a practical way. I think that's a great example of how you can turn that on its head. It's
similar to in permaculture, where we are always seeking there are very strategic things that you're looking for when you're seeking to interfere in a situation. It's the burden of the intervener is a phrase that's used a lot, which I think applies to divination and magic as much as permaculture. They're all magic anyway. But it is that if you just try to apply pressure on all points, they won't necessarily all have the biggest impact, but you can find sort of like joints, sort of places where there are not weaknesses, because it's not necessarily a weakness that you're exploiting, but places where more change is possible if you hit it on that joint, and then you can get more of an impact, more of a change from intervening at that particular point. So it sounds to me like that use of the self-doubt would be an example of finding a point of intervention that can help break something open and get something else in, which is usually what we're looking for in magic and divination too, which is looking for best possible timing, best possible avenues into something to make a change.
It's interesting too, because one of the things when you write a book of magic poems and make an oracle deck and send these things out, I'm doing this in a general sense too, right? I don't know who's going to pick up this book. I don't have a chance to do direct healing in that fashion. But what I can do is introduce people to healing spirits, right? And I can basically say, this is your ticket to the doctor, and the doctor is the healing spirit in question. One other story about the healing process. I had a friend who I met in the first healing I did off of this book or with this method was with a spirit named Thursois, who's Thursois appeared to me in vision as a very grumpy, weasel-headed man who was angry at me. I had a bad toe break when I was doing martial arts competitively. I won't describe it. It was bad enough that a seasoned black belt went and threw up when he saw it happen, which I thought was really funny because I was trying to find where the med tent was. And he goes, I don't know. And he just went and threw up, which I was like, hey, I guess it's bad.
Oh, God.
I had surgery on it. Everything else is all fine. But the spirit was a bone setting spirit. And so he looked at my toe and said, why didn't you ask me to fix this? And I was like, I didn't know you back then, dude. I'm sorry. He's like, why should time matter? Why does that matter? Which is a really interesting and strange thing I hadn't sat with. And you would think the next part of this story would be me going back in time and fixing my own toe, which I did not do. But instead, that would have been smart. But instead, a friend called me the next day, and she's a runner, and she had done, she ran habitually for her mental health. This was really important to her. And she had had a bad injury and called to tell me she had broken her toe, which, by the way, it's only recently that I put those two together, that I had a toe injury, then she had a toe injury. It's like the spirit was really hammering this in, you know what I mean? But so she calls me, she's extremely upset about this and asks if there's anything I can do. She's witchy. We decided to do a healing. So I told her I just talked with the spirit. Can I try something and see if it'll work? She says, yes. So I drew out an image of the spirit, and that didn't seem complete. So I said an extempore poem over the image, and I put it in a little postcard, mailed it off to her, took a picture on my phone, sent it to her, told her that's what happened. She goes into the doctor. This was like a Friday. She goes into the doctor on Monday. The doctor says, why are you here? You don't have a broken toe. And she called me, and her first question was, what the fuck did you do? Because she had a broken toe, but by the time she gets to the doctor's office, it's no longer broken. Now, it is possible, there's lots of ways you can sort of analyze this. It's possible, and my favorite version is that an Egyptian time spirit of healing that does bone setting went back in time and altered the nature of her injury so that by the time it goes to the doctor, it's no longer a broken toe. I like this version because it also gives her agency. She had had injuries before. She knew what this was. She's not hysterical. You know what I mean? Or you can say that by going through this placebo effect, I caused her immune system to kick into gear, and what had been a bad sprain or something of that nature was now suddenly fixed much faster than it would have been, and her recovery time was incredibly quick, right? Either one's fine. I actually don't care which one people like. Her toe got better. Right. Yeah. So, that's the kind of thing we're talking about doing here. Did I know the best method to energetically heal her toe? No. The spirit took care of that because it was the spirit's office and function to do so. The spirit wanted to do that and was mad at me for not doing it because it was its office and function to do so. And I think that is something, I wouldn't suggest going to just any spirit and being like, fix my toe. Like they have desires and offices and jobs and natures. And, to your point about the joints, like there's a reason that these Decan spirits have been chosen with their specific things. I would not go to one that does bone setting with my heart issues, right? That's going to the wrong doctor. And I suspect, just like cardiologists, they have very little knowledge of bones if you go to the wrong guy. So that's how we sort of work with this idea of how do we know how to do proper diagnosis all the time? We don't. We talk to the spirits.
Yeah, I think that's also it's an important point that I think is now getting a lot more traction, at least within the spiritual witchcraft traditions. I shouldn't really speak. I don't have that much context for it, but I have heard more conversations around the need for specificity, the need to take who you are talking to and in what ways more seriously, and not expecting general solutions to give you everything that you need. There are times and places for generalists and for, just kind of putting calls out to the universe in general ways that can get exactly what you need, because you don't have, that's what you need to do at that particular moment. But there is also there's so much information out there, and there is a great deal that can be done, perhaps in better ways, if you are going to the right spirits in the right ways, which is also means that you have to really be taking seriously the personhood, the realness of these spirits that you're dealing with. Not one is not the same as the other. They're not just interchangeable Lego blocks. Which that's another kind of discussion of interaction with them, which kind of brings me to how, questions around how we do interact with these Decan spirits and what they like and how you work with them for healing.
Well, so what I am presenting is an artistic method of engaging with these spirits, because I think that art is the most accessible boundary between, or kind of magic, I should say, actually, to do this. One of my early readers was surprised with the poems. He's like, these are not binding invocations. These are not, you're not saying, I challenge you, Thursoise, to now heal these bones of this person. They're personal poems about my own experience of getting in touch with the spirit. It's what communicated to me and brought out of me. In this, I'm really following the poet HD and attempting to apply some of her theories of image and bringing spirit into contact. So the poem becomes basically a letter of introduction, or a sort of place of meeting where you can encounter the spirit and move forward in that direction. So the method I talk about that I use is very simple. It is the contemplation of the image, is the reading of the poem, and then it is sitting and waiting for the spirit to communicate with you. I actually don't think it's much harder than that. However, the other method that we came up with was realizing that in the tradition, and mostly this is drawn from the sacred book of Hermes to Asclepius, which is a Hellenistic text of magic dealing with the Decans. And in that version, the image of the god is engraved on a stone, usually set over a certain kind of plant and given to the person, or worn as a phylactery. So, you have this idea of like amulets that you could carry with you at all times. And when Jen at Revelor, my editor at Revelor, who's fantastic, by the way, and also just as a quick plug, there's so many good books at Revelor. Like, please just go check out the site. It's fantastic. There's so much good stuff. But she asked me, is there anything I would want the book to do if I could do whatever it was? I was like, yeah, could it be in a circle around someone? She's like, art books are expensive. That's not what we're going for here. But what if we did an oracle deck? What if we did a deck of these things? And it became clear that this is very much what the spirits wanted. They wanted a talismanic object that you could use to communicate with them, that you could use to carry with you if you were having an issue, if you wanted to feel that healing presence, be closer, or to give to someone as an object of the healing. And part of this from the beginning, as you can see with my story about my friend, was the idea of giving someone this physical object to produce the healing. In her case, she got the image, but she did eventually get the postcard in the mail as well. And I think it is entirely possible to interact with the spirits just from the image in the poem. But I think they also very much like these talismanic engagements where there's a physical bridge to connect you or them back to each other. And so the poems are the images, the cards are the images of the spirit and fragments from the poems in a sort of Sibylline tradition to try to draw those two ideas together. So yeah, that's my idea, is art. I invented it. That's how you know.
You invented art. Thank you, Brian.
You're welcome, everyone.
All of us, for all of humanity.
Yes, you're welcome.
No, I the tiny section of your 20-page essay introducing poems that I also particularly loved was there was a description that you had of when does spirit enter the act of a dancer dancing? Like what is the role of spirit in the act of making art? And when I was thinking about this, and I was talking to Daryl about this, my husband, and of course we're both artists, we're both musicians. He's a composer as well, and we were discussing that, and the act of doing these things. There are physical elements to it which are required in order for any of this to happen, but then there is something that also enters in through the acts, through the physicalization of like the dancer's movements or rhythm, or a musician picking up an instrument and playing a certain set of notes, or a singer, vocalizing something. That it is those actions, but then there's also a spirit that's behind it. And we,
Right.
as humans, there is something where we can tell. It's like how do you know a duck is a duck? Like we just know it's a duck. There's a way that we can know when someone is simply performing actions and when spirit has entered, and that is sort of in the room as well. But that's not something that we can really break down. And I think that has to do very much with then how divination works, and how clearly then how art is the easiest way of bridging that divide and getting either new information or simply having engagements and creating new relationships. That art is an easy vector, because it is that something very impossible to describe that's in between the two worlds.
Much like, I was going to say much like dream, but it actually has a different quality. One of the great things, I said I edited over the course of a year. That's not entirely true. As I mentioned earlier, my magical partner Jess did a lot of editing on this particular project. And one of the great gifts she gave me was reading the poems aloud so that I could hear them. And as you were saying, you could immediately hear which poems had spirit, which part was pulling away from the spirit that was present, what gave it life, where was that properly arranged. Because I think another thing we don't do very well is realize that you can fail at this stuff. You can create an imperfect ritual. You can perfect it over time. You can make it better, and you can find, and by make it better, I mean create the space for that spirit to be more present, because of the arrangement you have created that allows for that particular harmony, that particular identity to be created, or not created, but to dwell in it. So I think that art is honestly the magic that survived for us, that it is something we're still taught can work, and that's one reason I do it. But it's always physical. I don't believe there's any art that isn't physical. And I think that's important to keep in mind here, is that this isn't just a fantasy. We're not just pretending or playing out an idea that this could be real. It's doing some level of actual work and connection in order to have it happen. You mentioned in the beginning of my biography that I'm a Tai Chi teacher. You can wish all day that you have mastered the Tai Chi form, but then someone comes and pushes on you and you have not. And it's very easy to do the think system for playing violin, right? But that doesn't work.
May not sound as great as you want it to in your head then.
No, and I
actually asked to play it.
And I think that that's something that's true of magic as well, is that, you can think system this as much as you want, but unless it's been put to the test, unless you can say there are results, and unless you can stand behind them and do something in your practice to make it better, then it's just mental masturbation, and it doesn't do anything.
There was a conductor who we used to work with, whose famous quote, if he was frustrated by the orchestra, he would just kind of stand there and say, whatever you do something, So any of the musicians that I'm with, sometimes we'll just be like, you have to do something, but you do. It's either you're doing it, if you're just thinking it and you're thinking you're doing it, you may not actually have the ability. It may not be coming forward in the world itself. So yeah.
100%. I mean, and again, if we look at Galen, if we look at the Greco-Egyptian magical papyruses, if we look at Jesus, even as an example, they're all doing things. Jesus is spitting into mud and putting it on a dude's eyes. Like it's, and that's supposed to be the Son of God who can just snap his fingers and everything happens. But that guy seemed to think the mud was important. And this is so I think that that's something we have to consider when we do this kind of bringing in of spirit, that if there is no physical nature, then I do not think that spirit becomes present.
Yeah, and I'll just put in, because I work with the oracles of Apollo, which is based on the way that the Greek oracle, the Greek alphabet was used at times as an oracular system of divination, which I find fascinating. But there was always a physicalization of your omen, of whatever you had gotten as your message from the gods. You had to physicalize it in some way, to inscribe it or make a talisman or make a prayer or do something with it in order to solidify the omen. So if you wanted that to come true, you couldn't just be like, oh, thanks so much, and then walk away. You had to tangibilize it, physicalize it in some way in order for the divination to be complete. That was actually considered the last step of the divination. And without that, it was incomplete. It could not go so well for you, because you might actually end up offending the spirits because you didn't close the loop in that sense. Or it just might not happen because you didn't close the loop.
This is something I would love to get your thoughts on, actually. One of the ideas I'm working with and playing with is that we don't really understand the word oracle very well in English, that even its English roots are deeper than we give it credit for, that the oracle is not just the message, but also the place of action and the temple and the person who's giving you the thing. It's all of these things at once. And I think it's kind of important that it is. It plays a little bit to what you were just saying. But if we think an oracle is just a way of communicating, I think it hampers our idea of what even communication actually is in this way. I don't know. What do you think about, I mean, you were sort of leading into this, but what do you think about the efficacy of the oracle? Like, where do we look at an oracle and all those different elements in terms of terms like the magician or the witch or the healer?
It's interesting that for the work that I do, I will call myself a seer, but that's not really the correct term for doing the work that I do within the Greco-Roman tradition. The word that comes closer is oracle. To refer to myself as an oracle, though, confuses people in the modern day, because they're like, wait, what? You're an oracle deck? You think you're a deck of cards? Oh, we knew she was crazy, but now myth confirmed. But it is the fact that there is an activity to it that is not. There's a great deal of passivity, unfortunately, in how we've been led to interact with divination and even with spirit contact. It's still very passive in that way. And I think that when we use the word oracle and we acknowledge, as you said, that place, person, method of communication, and the closing the loop with, how it interacts with the world is all one concept and is all very active. That's a different way of interacting with spirits and the past, present, and future, and knowledge about it. So I think it's really interesting you bring that up, because I was actually just having a conversation with someone the other day about exactly that, about how the word oracle is far better, but it's a word that is seriously misunderstood and misused in our culture right now. So it's difficult to rehabilitate, shall we say.
Yeah, it's, and again, like all magical things, when you're like, I am an oracle, people are just, it doesn't sound, we've lost the sense that this stuff sounds good. In the same way that up until recently, if you were like, I'm a witch, people would just absolutely lose their minds. It's something I think we should spend a little time thinking about how to reclaim, because I think there is a particular kind of upwelling that happens in that, the moment of time and being focused in a physical person and then object, etc. It's very specific and I think very useful, in the same way that something like being an exorcist or being a cunning person, these are specific modes of engaging with spirit, and they all have their place. And I think it's something we should grab back a little bit.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, because I think that when we allow things to just be generalized into larger terms, it maybe is easier for conversation for a little while, but ultimately degrades kind of this, what we're really trying to say, like knowing what someone means when they say they are an oracle. That has layers of meaning that has to be unpacked, but it would be really interesting and probably a better conversation once we start to have that.
Sure.
I would like, however, because I've seen that we have many people who have put in some questions for you as
right.
a diviner. And therefore, speaking of ways of knowing and knowledge, okay, somebody just put in a very long question.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'm gonna pass this to you in the chat, Brian.
Okay.
Because it also brings up something which I love getting my guests to talk about, and you know this because you've been a guest on my show before, so I'm going to paste this in. This was the question that was asked. This was in the form, so I don't know who asked it. It's a long question, and so I now put this to you, Brian, as geomancer, as diviner, as how would you ask this question? Are you going to ask the cards exactly how this person put their question in that long form, or would you synopsize it and ask a shorter version of that question, since you don't have the person in front of you?
Yeah. You obviously, one of the things I think is important for any sort of active divination is workshopping the question. Is I often, if someone hires me to do geomancy or anything like that, we spend a lot of time kind of winnowing down to what we actually want to know and what is actually important. You get clear, and largely that's just because you get clearer answers. However, there are times when I will just shorthand it, but it really is just meant to be a shorthand of the longer question. Because sometimes long questions are valid. We have these bigger ideas that are hard to work with. And, geomancy, for example, does really well with yes or no questions. And so it's often good to move it into that zone. But those aren't the only kind of questions that exist in the world. And over time, you should be able to do something more than that. In this particular question, it's about work, personal, and spiritual balance. And one of the things where I being picky is I might take a moment and be like, well, are they different? Aren't they all the same? But it's not actually fair to the question. The question here is a good one, which is how do I prioritize these different elements of my life as I come into a different time? And in this case, the person gave me a specific time frame, which is between now and October. I'm going to tell you what kind of an answer we're going to get before we get the answer. I'm not going to tell you what the answer is because I don't know yet, but the kind of answer. So the question of, can you give me insight into where I should be currently putting my energy and efforts? Yeah, I sure can. No, the question here is going to be, what it's going to come out is going to be a deeper kind of insight into what the person needs. That's what this kind of question drives. So the question could be, where am I going to put my efforts? And you're going to end up with an oracle of like, you need more sleep or something along those lines. But I'm going to read for it. So let me explain a little bit of the method that I use. So there is no formal method for using this oracle. The method that gives you clear answers is the correct method. I prescribe none. I will tell you what I do and why, and then we'll grab the thing. So it's a double deck. It's 72 cards, 36 white, 36 black. The decans are repeated as they go through, and this is meant to reflect a sort of polarity around the concept. So the idea that like you may have and I tend to see the white cards as more active, the black cards as more receptive, the white cards as more, not necessarily positive, but think about like a bright shining of the sun, and the black cards is more of a night figure. It's very complicated and deep. I chose white and black. No, but the idea is that not to think of one as good or evil or positive or negative in that sense, but rather all the things that we could think of as night. It is both frightening and it is both soothing, right? The sun is a blistering thing at noon and also a beautiful dawn when it happens. So it works in that kind of active and passive understanding. I steal from geomancy because geomancy steals from astrology. So if we have longer time, I might do a whole houses reading where the decans show up in the 12 houses. In this case, I'm going to steal a different thing for geomancy, which is the right witness, left witness, and judgment. So the right witness will reflect what is being brought in by the person asking the question. The left witness is going to reflect what the world is bringing in, and the judgment and all three cards together will be a resolution that provides a sort of answer. If there's not clarity, I will pull one more card called the statement, which is the result of the judgment. So if you go with this, this is what happens, right? So right witness, left witness, and judgment. So the right witness is Gemini 2, Samurois, which I'll hold up for people to see. And the line of poetry on that is the buoyant line of breath suspended between the wine glass and the fine deep night. The left witness is Gemini 3 in the negative, in the dark as well, as you will. It says, to refuse to choose is also a choice. Silence the roaring voice of the unsaid. And then for the judgment, we have Cancer 3, Charmine, which is this one. The flipped coin's peak, counting drips and missing rain. So the way I use this is you could apply all kinds of astrological knowledge to this if you have it. I don't, actually, for a guy who made a book of astrological poems. I don't know shit about astrology. You should hire an astrologer. What I do is I work from the spirit and the poetry. So much in the way of sort of taking a verse from the Sibyl, I start with the poem and then I work my way back, right? So in this case, we have the question of like, what should I do with my spiritual and personal and work time? How do I balance this? Where should I put my energy? The energy being brought forward by the person is this moment of suspension, the line of breath between the wine glass and the night, which is also this image of like wishing to hit that perfect note of beauty and relaxation, right? Where everything feels at ease and you have those clear moments where it just kind of hovers, right? I would also say in a very practical sense, this person is ready to have a glass of wine and step aside is like, I am feeling stressed and I don't want to deal with it. Thank you kindly. I'd rather be over here. But the world is saying you have to choose. To refuse to choose is also a choice. So if you do nothing, if you just sit there, that's a choice as well. You know, you're going to miss out. So then the question becomes, which all works with the reading, right? That's where we are. We're at this moment of wishing for an easy, relaxing answer, something that can restore the balance. And we have a response that says, nope, you have to choose. The world is going to make you choose. The question then is the flipped coin's peak, counting drips and missing rain. What's happening here is that when you're counting drips and missing rain, you can take this as like a negative, but it's not. This is the advice. You could look at a big picture and say, my God, this is such a big thing. How does my work work? How does my magic work? What do I do? This is saying, stop thinking about those things as big concepts and instead say, what are the moments of actual doing? You know, rather than say, how do I prioritize my magic? Think, oh, I'm going to do my daily prayers, right? It's no longer this one monolithic giant concept that's impossible to figure out. How can I fit in all my magic with my work and my family? You know, instead it's, well, do your daily prayers. Okay. How do I fit in my work? Well, work is a giant concept, but sometimes it's like on Tuesdays, I work from 9 to 5 and I have 4 meetings, right? Get into the details and the specifics, and then how you put your energy out will become abundantly clear. It's only the ghost of the large image that is what is terrifying. Each of the tasks is imminently doable. Mm-hmm. So that would be my rating.
Yeah, I think that makes a great deal of sense. I would completely agree with that. It's beautiful how the poetry interacts with that. And as you mentioned, I'm sure if you wanted to also then go with astrological readings on that, could also give someone insight. If that was the strength, that they had, then I'm sure that the cards would respond in kind and give you something that also went with that.
Yeah, it's funny how often, in fact, Jen, who's Jen's art, obviously an excellent astrologer, she was pulling cards off the deck and realizing that she was pulling the natal decan for most of her people she was reading for, So I think it's another case too of what you bring to the oracle will respond to you with. I'm a much better poet than I am astrologer, so the poetry speaks to me and helps me understand.
Absolutely.
But yeah, all those pieces are there for you to listen to. Yeah.
It's always that thing of the communication is actually a lot easier than sometimes we make it.
Yes.
We think it has to be so complicated, but no, sometimes it's not.
I had one of my
They want
readers
to work with us.
Yeah, I had a reader early on who was like, wow, you really don't give advice for people to how to use this book. And I was like, no, I don't. Because I don't wish to prescribe a method. I don't want to tell someone who picks up these cards and has a different reading than I have, but it changes their life in a positive way, that I'm right because I made these cards and I know the answer. Like, I'm not going to steal the agency from the spirits.
Absolutely. Now, I remember I got to handle the cards when we saw each other in Austin a few weeks ago, and you just handed the cards to me and I read with them the way that I usually do, sort of short readings for myself, which was not the way that you just demonstrated reading. Worked beautifully for me. I got a really, really clear, very helpful answer. I had no context for it. There is no little white book. There is none of that. We each have our own way of interacting with them. When I get my copy again, that I can start to work with more, I'm sure there may be a new way that I end up interacting with them. I want to do one more question before we end. I feel like it would be great to have one more example. How can I be a better high priestess?
What's funny about this?
Like one that was very a large question with lots of different tiers to it, and then I wanted one that was really short. So
I'm laughing in some ways because I asked a very similar question to some other diviners very recently, and I got it. So I'm now curious to see about how this answer turns out.
Yes, we shall see.
How can I be a better high priestess? Sorry, that is a very annoying diviner habit of laughing as cards come out, but it is I don't know, I can't stop myself. This is what happens. So the first card is Scorpio 2 Tormentus, and I'll describe this for people who may not be seeing it. This is an image. Brennan's images, by the way, are fantastic, and I absolutely love them. I did not guide his images. He had his own experience of the spirits, and that's what came up. So it's an image of a guy riding, surfing a giant scorpion, which I think is fantastic. But the poem is, well, I'll go through. So Scorpio 2. Then we have Virgo 3, Mycolaus, which is a sort of mummy wrapped up there. And then the last one, which is what made me laugh, is Aries 3, Dysonophius. Sometimes I can't say it, which is the image of a woman with a cobra wrapped around in the circle.
I love that Decan. I will just say right now.
This is a really fun one. So the poetry though. So in the first place, the right witness, we have the titanic waterspout of love, one great graceful doom. Doom in this sense is in the sort of Anglo-Saxon Germanic sense of your fate. It's not necessarily bad, it's just what it is. And the rest of the poem kind of makes that clear. Virgo 3, the dark version. Like cedar resin, dripped linen, bound beauty to the dead. There's no sin. And then Aries 3, her hand on his throat, she lowers her mouth, star perfume, falling light. I'm going to be completely honest. This is an incredibly erotic set of readings here. It's and I think that's intentional. I think it's part of it. The waterspout of love image in this case is, this is again the person's desire. So there's this moment of as high priestess or any other function like this, you don't do it because, not in a real case, you don't do it because of ego or what it gets you. It's a ton of work. It's a ton of effort. And you do it because of love. And the very question of how do I be a better high priestess is literally the how do I manifest this? How do I do this in the way that's important? The caution the poem offers here, though, is that you are fated to do this. You're going to do this. There's, you brought this with you already. But it's also intense, and understanding of how to do it right keeps our doom good, right? Like, it helps us figure that out. What the world or spirits in this case are communicating is this idea of like the bound beauty and there being no sin. There's no wrong way to be a high priestess. I mean, actually, correction. You could be a horrible monster who does abusive things to people, but at that point, you're no longer a high priestess. Do you know what I mean? You've become a monster.
Yeah. Then you are not the office anymore. You're simply abusing the title, but that's not
100%
doing the work anymore. Yeah.
And so what this is saying is that, like, there is no wrong way to do this. So, but this is why it's hard. So the question of how do I do better, because I feel this overwhelming sprout of love inside me, how do I do this? And how do I be better? And the answer the world gives you is do whatever you want. Doesn't matter. It's fine. That's frustrating as shit. You know what I mean? Like, that's not a full answer. It's somewhat reassuring, but it's not a full answer. So that's why we have the judgment here. Her hand on his throat, she lowers her mouth, star perfume, falling light. This image and this poem are about a woman dancing with a cobra. It's the snake charmer who understands that the being she's working with is dangerous, is real, could kill her, right? But with love and seduction and patience, she not only controls the spirit falls in love with her, right? The snake does it because of this dance. It's not forceful. You cannot force the cobra into this moment. You must relate directly and use this balancing point of dance and love and attention, close attention to this moment for it to work. This idea of star perfume in the falling light, at the end, it has to be inspirational, right? It has to come from the stars, come from the spirit. So in a practical sense, what I would say is take the attitude of the snake charmer, where it's not just, and actually in a weird way, I'm going to say this actually works out two ways. It's not just dancing with the god, right? Although that is a key part. It's also dancing with the coven, the congregants, whoever, in the same way. They too are the serpent, right? They too have to be loved and danced with, but kept at bay. You can't just let them into your bosom and let them bite you, right? That boundary line must be firmly established, and it must be on the terms of the priestess, I would say, in this case, the woman in the center, balancing this out. So to round out in brief terms, you're born to be a high priestess. It's great that you want to be better. There is no wrong way to be a high priestess if you are expressing who you are, but you can get better by establishing better boundaries, but not in the terms of separation. I don't think you can do that. I think instead it's establishing the boundaries of the dance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That is absolutely beautiful. And I would love to, before, as we wrap up, I would love to throw it out to you for you to read us one of the poems of one of the decans, because you read beautifully. I have gotten to hear you read poetry myself, and I want our listeners to hear that. And I don't want to choose it. I'm imagining you. I see that you have one chosen. Excellent. Oh, yeah. Well, wonderful. Okay.
I asked ahead of time which decan was your natal decan. So I thought I would read that one this evening in honor of our very kind host.
Right.
So, wait, do you share your natal decan material? So should I not mention that?
No, it's totally fine.
Okay, it's cool.
I'll tell everyone all my astrological information. I don't know why anyone would be curious, but you know.
I just realized that's like a thing.
No.
Aries 1, Alathamus, the head. And am I not also spring, waiting here in the dark, black dirt, rich in gems, rich in wanting, impatient as the thaw draws the ache from my stones, oh, grinding of frost heaves, how long must I dream of seed planted in my chest to pull at once for water and sky? Take from me my rib for your trees, my spine for your cowslips, fingernail irises, teeth lilies, and shin orchid, all I will bear, whatever you wish, for the song of the wind in your hair. A single sun-lipped kiss will keep me tangled in your roots. My love, don't forget I too have waited the winter.
That is beautiful. That is absolutely beautiful. Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate that. And I am sure that people will be very, very appreciative of reading all of the poems, as I have been being able to read them a little bit in advance of some other people. And the pre-order is available. And I think that people should definitely go and pre-order the deck and the book so that they can experience this for themselves. It is transformative. And I think that it is a wonderful reintroduction for these spirits to a lot of people. They are clearly becoming much more present in our world. There's been so much more discussion of them lately, and I know I am very happy to be engaging with them more. And yeah, I'm so excited about this. Is there anything else besides this that you want to share with people? Either of just like thoughts that you have that you want to share with people about divination or this work, or things that you have coming up that you want to share with us?
I don't have anything else coming up at the moment. I will say that if you do pre-order the book, that in addition to the actual decans, it became clear that the fixed stars wanted a presence in this book. And so there are some cards that go along with the fixed stars that for pre-order people can get, that have some angels and fixed star connections to them. No, what I wanted to say most at this point actually is thank you for letting me come and share with this tonight. I believe wholeheartedly that we can claim our own healing and that it is necessary for us to do so. And I appreciate the opportunity to share that with people tonight. And what I would urge people is, whether you pick up the book or whether you just like some of the ideas that you've heard, don't hesitate to do art for your healing and the healing of the people around you. Be bold, be honest, and put your desires and wishes for healing out there strongly, and do good in this world. You can do it. Your work will be good. And that's mostly what I want people to take away from this.
I could not agree more, nor could I have put it as beautifully. So thank you for sharing that, Brian. And thank you for everyone who put questions in, and thank you, Brian, for answering some of people's questions with this beautiful oracle. I think it's a lovely way for us to get to experience it. And I am super excited for the next time that I have you on, that we have another reason for you to come and chat with us, because I know these are wonderful conversations. So I appreciate them very much. And I will look forward to the next time.
I look forward to that as well. Thank you, Joanna.
All right. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody. Well, that was an inspiring conversation, and I really appreciate Brian taking the time to come on the show and speak about his new deck, the book, and of course, share a little of how he reads and works with the spirits intrinsically a part of that oracle. The Decans are ancient beings, and I'm grateful to Gordon White for bringing the Decan walk to life, as we mentioned, through Rune Soup, and I will also be linking to his site if you're interested in learning more about that. The astrologer Austin Coppock has also written an excellent, though currently very difficult to get a hold of, book about the Decans called 36 Faces, which I'll also link to, and hopefully a new edition and release of that work will be out in the world sometime soon. I highly recommend checking out Revelor Press's site and, of course, pre-ordering your copy of the Oracle of Decans if you haven't already. If you want to be on the list to get an invite to our special live editions of Coffee and Divination, like this one was, where you can get the chance to possibly have your question answered by one of our guests, then click over to our divination website and join the Coffee and Divination newsletter. We always have a really fun time in the chat and the Q&As for these. As always, thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts if you enjoy what we're doing here. That really helps us. And check out our website at coffeeanddivination.com. Enjoy your journeys with divination, and we'll see you next time.